Okay, so we've reached the point now where we're going to talk about vascular seeded plants. And this is exciting because we've moved in evolutionary time to the point where we actually have seed. And so with the seed, there's a lot of advantages. There's a lot more protection for the actual gametophyte and sporophyte in its early stages. And also, this contributes to the movement to land is that once there are development of seeds, the plant no longer relies on water in order for it to reproduce. We no longer observe the need for water for plants. So we're going to talk about two main lineages of the seed plant development. So first, I want to say that because of the advantages of seeds and, like we mentioned, the protection, the amount of nutrients can store, and the ability or the not required need of water anymore, we actually have quite a diversity of seed plants now. And so here I'm just showing you an example of a gymnosperm where I'm showing you the pine tree and an example of a gametophyte, which would be a pine cone. We're going to focus, as I mentioned, two different lineages. We're going to be focusing mainly on the gymnosperm and the angiosperm. But first, let's just look at seed plants as a whole. So seed plants are really diverse. They're the most plentiful land plants, and seed plants are also sporophyte dominant. So while previously we have seen the plants being gametophyte dominant, if you recall when we were looking at plants that rely on water, they were gametophyte dominant, and the sporophyte would be short-lived, only long enough for them to pretty much reproduce, and then they would go back to their gametophyte state. Well, now with seed plants, we are sporophyte dominant. Seeds play a strong advantage for plants because not only do seeds protect the sporophyte embryo, but it can also store food and nutrients for the embryo to allow the embryo to go ahead and basically survive in a wide variety of environments and habitat until environmental conditions become favorable enough that the sporophyte will then develop into a mature sporophyte. I want to emphasize once more that one of the main advantages of having seed is that water is no longer needed for reproduction. So the next time that you eat a seed, I want you to realize that you're actually eating a plant embryo. Congratulations. Okay, so let's look some more at seed plants. We're going to break down to the two lineages in a little bit. But first, I want to go over how seed plants can actually have two types of spore. It can develop into two types of gametophyte. So as you can envision, we can develop into a male gametophyte, and a plant can develop into a female gametophyte. So the plant will release pollen grain. This is released through wind. It could be released through animals brushing by, but it's not through water. We no longer rely on water. So the seed plants will release the pollen grain. These are actually the male gametophyte. So whenever you have an allergic reaction because of pollens, congratulations, you have plant sperms up your nose. The female gametophyte is developing inside the ovule. So we can see here that the female developed inside ovule, and the seed is actually a mature ovule. Let's go visit our first lineage, which is the gymnosperm. The gymnosperm is a vascular seed plant that contains a naked seed. So what do we mean by naked seed? This means that the ovules and the seeds are exposed to the surface on the cone scale. So if we look at the cone scale, we can actually see the ovule and the seeds exposed. They are not enclosed in like what we know now as fruits, right? So there's no fruit, they're naked, their unfertilized seeds are open to the air to be directly fertilized by pollination. And so this will include dominant conifers, so pine trees, fir trees, redwoods. These are all different examples of gymnosperm. And the conifer, as we mentioned, on the cone itself will contain the reproductive structure of the plants. So that is, the ovules and the seeds are exposed right there on the surface. Let's take a look at some gymnosperm examples. So here are some of the gymnosperm. You probably recognize a lot of them. So the cyclad is actually, let's take myself up here. The cyclad is actually the most ancient gymnosperm. We believe that they've been around since the Carboniferous period. This is the period that was that lasted roughly 300 to 400 million years ago. The environment at that time theorized to be really warm and humid. So these cyclads are actually what we believe are the oldest gymnosperm. Here are our more modern gymnosperm that we probably are more used to looking at. So you're probably very familiar with conifers, which are these cones that we observe here that actually will contain, again, as we mentioned, the reproductive structure of the plants. And so an example of that would be the coastal redwood. And the coastal redwood, not only is it a gymnosperm, but it's actually one of the tallest gymnosperm that we observe. Actually reach up to 100 meters in height, which is pretty amazing. So they're vascular plants. So they're able to pull the vascular from their roots all the way up. There's other adaptation that they have that we won't go into with regards to how they get water to the very top tip. But keep in mind, like, right, they're vascular and they have seeds on these cones right here. And also notice the leaves are needle-like, right? They're needle-like, scale-like leaves. So we typically think of them as evergreen. Gymnosperm life cycle, as mentioned previously, is dominantly in the sporophyte generation. So unlike previous plant ancestor that was in the gametophyte, once we have seeds, we are dominant sporophyte. The male and female cone will reproduce spores that will develop into the gametophyte. So you have the male and the female on the cone, right? The pollens are the male gametophyte, and when they are either carried by different animals or when they're released into the atmosphere via the wind kind of will carry the pollen from the male cone to the female cone, and that's when you have fertilization that actually happens. The fertilization will lead to formation of a seed, and that seed can then grow into a new sporophyte plant. So let's look at the life cycle on this illustration, just to kind of go over it again. So as we have seen already, that we have both the female ovule as well as the male gametophyte, which is the pollen grain on the cone surfaces, right? So here's the female cone, and here you have the male cone. And so both of these will go ahead and they will undergo meiosis in order to make gametes. So they're going to undergo meiosis and they're going to make gametes. So you have the female gametophyte, which is going to be the egg, and then you have the male gametophyte, which will be the sperm, aka the pollen grain. And so the pollen grain is going to be carried by the wind when the wind blows by, and the wind will then deposit this pollen grain onto the seed cone. So here you have the pollen grain depositing onto the seed cone. This results in fertilization. Once fertilization occurs, then you are forming the zygote, and from the zygote, the ovule can then develop into a mature seed. This mature seed, when the environmental conditions are optimal, will then grow into a new sporophyte. And eventually that new sporophyte will mature into what we know as a pine tree or a redwood coastal tree, etc. All right. Our next lineage that we're going to look at is the angiosperm. So the angiosperm, what differs from the angiosperm versus the gymnosperm is they're both vascular seeded plants, but now we have the evolution of flowers. So the angiosperm is when we start seeing flowers, and the angiosperm lineage is the most diverse plant lineage. So it's the only, these are the only plants that can actually make flowers and fruit. And so their seeds are no longer naked, their seeds are now covered. Roughly 6 times more plant species that are angiosperm compared to all the other plant groups combined. We currently know roughly 370,000 species of angiosperm. So you may recall seeing a lab, right, our plant display here where we show the reproductive structure. So the flower is a specialized reproductive structure. Most angiosperm have these different parts that we're going to go over. So despite them perhaps looking a little different, they will have a sepal right here. This is also known as a calyx, and this is basically going to protect the flower bud itself. They will also have petals. This is collectively known as the corolla, and they can be really diverse in the size, the shape, the color, as you probably notice when you look at a bunch of different flowering plants. And then we have the stalk here, which consists of the filament as well as the antler right here. And the pollen grain are actually produced in the antler. And then lastly, there will be a carpel. So here we have the carpel right here. The ovary is going to be at the base. That's where we're going to find the ovulo. And typically, there is an elevation of the stigma over here, and it is the stigma that will actually receive the pollen grain. These angiosperm all have these reproductive structure, but their appearance of the reproductive structure will vary. And you can guess that the reason why they vary so much and why we have so much diversity is because there's wide methods in which pollination can happen and the dispersal of seeds, right? So these plants have adapted to have different structure appearance depending on who and how they're pollinating their seeds, whether it be the wind or through animal pollinator, whether it be that the fruits are digested and the seeds can last in the animal digestive tract until the animal disperses the seed, or whether it be because the fruits can stick to certain surfaces, but they all will have these reproductive structure. And so every single time that you see a beautiful flower and you see the stigma, you come over and you sniff the flower, you're actually smelling plant genitals. Okay, so as we mentioned, the flower is a specialized reproductive shoot, right? And I mentioned to you guys that the seeds can develop inside the ovary, so that's where the ovulo is located. And this is the life cycle. So the life cycle, as we say, is that similar to gymnosperm, angiosperm is sporophyte dominant. So most of the life cycle will be in the sporophyte form. You have the reproductive structure right here. And when the pollen is able to land in the stigma, then we can have fertilization, which happens over here. But until then, first the spores will form, and the sporophyte will form spores, right, through, similar as we mentioned before, through meiosis. And so the sporophyte will form these spores. The spores can be both male spores and female spores, which we've seen before with the other plants, on whether it is a pollen grain or whether or not it's an ovulo. The pollen grain right here is going to land on the stigma, and it will travel down into where the ovulo is, and then we have fertilization. And we actually have a double fertilization here. So this is something that's new that we haven't introduced before. And double fertilization is because you have one sperm that's actually going to unite with the egg nucleus, and it's actually going to form a diploid zygote. The other sperm is going to unite with the other nuclei to form a triploid. So it's going to be 3 ends. So up to now, remember that when we have haploid, we're dealing with 1 end, and diploid is 2 ends. And so what we have happening is we have this double fertilization where one sperm will unite with the egg nucleus, and it will form the 2-end zygote, and the other sperm will unite with the other 2 nuclei, and it will form a 3-end endosperm. And so you might recognize the term endosperm from wheat germ, and we tend to consume wheat germ as an energy source. So there's a lot of energy source there. So AKA we can think of it as a food source for the embryo. Eventually, ovulo will become a seed that contains the sporophyte embryo. So this is the state that we have here, where the ovule becomes the seed, and then the endosperm is sometimes taken up and absorbed. The ovary will eventually become a fruit, and then we will eventually go back to the sporophyte. So one of the contribution of the diversity is this adaptation of the angiosperm. And the angiosperms are going to adapt so that they can have successful completion of their sexual reproduction, right? So they need to have effective dispersal of their pollens and their seeds. And so oftentimes the plants and the pollinator will co-evolve together because they're exerting different selection pressure on one another. So as one adapts to the environment and they kind of adapt and have certain changes, the other species also has to kind of adapt to be able to survive as well. So they'll do something called jointly evolving. And so the pollinators can range from insects to birds to other larger animals. And so these plants have evolved to have different smell, different colors to attract certain pollinators. You have bees, for example, that are attracted to the UV shading. So here's an example of this UV shading. So the bees will see a very different view of the flowers that kind of helps the bee be able to locate where the nectar is. You have flowers that bloom at nighttime, and so at nighttime the different pollinators aren't using their sight as much as during the daytime, so they might be more likely to use their other senses, for example, their odor. And so these night blooming flowers often will have a very aromatic smell to them so that they can actually attract the different mammals and insects. So you can see that there's a lot of different ways that we can apply pressure. Additionally, the fruit, which I didn't really show here, is another way to kind of disperse the seeds, right? So different fruits will attract different animals. Fruit can also be dispersed via the wind and just gravity. So even though we don't talk about how we don't need water anymore in order to be able to successfully reproduce, you can envision that when there's like a strong rain fall along with gravity and wind, that could also help disperse seeds and pollen. Okay, so I will post these up, these videos for you guys to reference to, but there's quite a few videos that talks about like the different type of pollination and just the diversity of plants and how they have adapted over time. So I would suggest that when you guys have the time to go ahead and take a look at these other resources. All right, that's it for our plant talk. See you guys next time.